walk through the garden.
It's become something of a commonplace to say that television has come of age, has become reputable, and is now better than film. But despite being like film a visual medium, it's hardly these stylistic qualities that have fed critics' enthusiasm for television drama. Historically, there are some good reasons for this. For example, TV creators typically have tighter production schedules and smaller budgets. Also, the television image is considerably smaller than the cinema screen and has lower resolution. Of course, in this day and age, the difference between film and television is not nearly as great as it used to be. With the introduction of the DVD and Blu-ray formats, as well as widescreen high-definition TVs, there are greater rewards for stylistic proficiency. It's hardly surprising, then, that TV series have become more aesthetically sophisticated. Many commentators have noted that modern television drama has grown more cinematic. Still, in purely visual terms, it seems likely that cinema will always have the upper hand, which is probably one reason why television scholars who have argued for the artistic legitimacy of television rarely mention style, and point instead to the medium's capacity for complex, long-form narratives, or for psychologically nuanced, multi-leveled characterization. HBO's The Wire is one of the most prominent and frequently cited examples of quality television. Indeed, many regard the series as the crown jewel in this most recent golden age of television. Again, though, the show's visuals are rarely, if ever, part of the critical acclaim. It's interesting here to note that two of the foremost authorities on film and television style have actually made passing remarks on The Wire's visual approach online, and none of them are particularly impressed. Television scholar Jeremy Butler declared that he found it hard to get beyond the show's mostly functional visual and sound style, and he considered the first few episodes downright clumsy stylistically. Film scholar David Bordwell, meanwhile, found The Wire overhyped, fragmented, and uninspiringly shot. In this video essay, I want to examine in greater detail the formal features of The Wire. In the process, I seek to demonstrate that the series' style is more interesting than Bordwell and Butler's skeptical, though admittedly sketchy remarks suggest. I want to emphasize at the outset that much as I admire The Wire, I too find that other features than style contribute more to the series' greatness, such as the inspired dialogue, the fierce humor, and the intricate plotting, not to mention the wildly ambitious panoramic view of institutional dysfunction in modern capitalist society. Ultimately, the style of The Wire serves to enhance the other strong suits of the show without drawing too much attention to itself. The first thing to note about The Wire's style, then, is that it's quite plain. This is, I think, somewhat unusual in today's high-end television. Contemporary TV series are typically characterized by at least intermittent moments of formal self-consciousness, as in this episode from The Sopranos. This is right at the beginning, so this is a good example of so-called delayed exposition. That is to say, we are thrust right into the story, witnessing an event with no information about what led up to it. So here we come across the main character, Tony Soprano, unconscious in his own kitchen, and we inevitably wonder what has happened.
Oh my God. Tony! Tony! Oh my God, Tony. Are you all right?
Uncle Ben.
What happened?
We quickly learn what led up to this moment, but not as we might expect through a flashback. Instead of a jump backwards in time, the tape is rewound, so that we see everything in reverse motion, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until it's like someone presses a play button, and we get to see what happened just prior to Tony's blackout. Clearly, in this scene, the style is not transparent. The story does not simply unfold. Instead, the telling of the story is foregrounded and draws attention to itself. This kind of blatant formal self-consciousness is virtually wholly absent in The Wire. There are just some very few and mostly quite insignificant exceptions. There's a mysterious, abrupt black and white insert in the morgue in Season 1, and accelerated motion is used briefly in one of the series' remarkably few montage sequences. There's just a single instance of film style clearly mimicking character psychology, in Season 2 after Siggy has impulsively shot and killed Gleekus in his store, and then wanders out into the street. Here both the sound and the image suggest Siggy's sense of dreamlike detachment before he wakes up to the reality of what he's done. As you can see, this scene includes slow motion as well. There are a couple of other examples of that, but again a lot fewer than you're likely to run into in just about any other 60 hours of television drama. And there are none of the fantasy or dream sequences that have become so prominent and in my opinion tiresome in modern TV drama. And practically all the music is diegetic, which means that it's realistically motivated. It originates from within the story world and can be heard not only by the television audience but by the characters as well. In other words, there is no external musical score to emphasize the emotional atmosphere of a scene. No sad violins have been added to tell you when to cry, and there are no dramatic drums to cue suspense. In fact, the slow motion scene we're looking at here is one of the very few in which a musical score has been added. It's interesting to contrast The Wire's restraint in this respect with the first television series that David Simon was involved with, albeit not as a showrunner, namely Homicide. Notice the heavy-handed sound effects in the upcoming clip.
Why'd you quit? Because Jeremy and I started a relationship. A love affair.
It's so ham-fisted and overstated that it almost plays like parody. The Wire, by contrast, trusts you to recognize a startling or scandalous piece of information on your own, without the aid of sound effects, and this makes The Wire's narration much more subtle. Also, there's no voiceover on The Wire, and unlike most TV series these days with their jumping backwards and forwards in time, the story is practically entirely linear. There's just a single flashback at the end of the very first episode, and to be honest, it sticks out like a sore thumb.
See the man you identified sitting in the courtroom today.
He's right there.
One of the most refreshing things about The Wire is that you don't feel you're being condescended to. The creators trust you to be able to follow the story without having to continuously signpost and repeat important information. This flashback, though, has clearly been inserted only to make sure that everybody in the audience knows it was the witness we saw earlier in the episode who's been killed. It's a rather cringe-worthy moment, actually. It was HBO that insisted on the flashback, and it was a bad decision. Still, for all intents and purposes, The Wire presents events in plain chronological order, and to do so for 5 seasons, while pretty standard in television's first decades, is actually quite unusual these days. Another rather old-fashioned feature of The Wire is that all 5 seasons are screened in the outmoded 4:3 format, rather than the now customary 16:9 format. In any case, I find that The Wire's unself-conscious, unobtrusive style is suitable, as it contributes to the show's realist, often documentary-like aesthetic.
When you walk through the garden, you gotta watch your back.
In fact, talking about cinematic sources of inspiration, David Simon has often said that he's learned a lot from watching documentaries, especially the work of Frederick Wiseman, a key proponent of the so-called observational mode of documentary filmmaking, which eschews overt exposition and reflexive devices. Simon interestingly states that documentarians are more an influence on my style, or lack of style perhaps, than many auteurs. This documentary impulse goes a long way towards accounting for The Wire's plain and casual visual style. Sometimes a cinema verite look is explicitly evoked, with deliberate swish pans and zooms imitating a camera trying to orient itself, striving to catch up with events, thus creating a sense of immediacy. David Simon has repeatedly stated that he was not very involved in the development of The Wire's look, though with his background as a reporter on the Baltimore Sun, he states that he did contribute towards the co-optation of a journalistic logic, as he calls it. In a talk he gave at the University of Southern California in 2008, Simon went on to say that the one thing that I brought to the table was that I never wanted to see the camera fish. I never wanted to see the camera know more than it ought to know. So if a conversation is filmed in a continuous take, the camera should not move to the next speaker ahead of time, just because the camera operator has read the script and knows whose line is up next. Simon would rather have the camera arrive on the next speaker late, as we'll see an example of in this clip.
It's like, what's it? Hypocritical?
I mean, yeah, we got our thing, but it's just part of the big thing.
Exactly.
In other words, the camera should behave as a documentarian's camera, acting as if the action hasn't been staged but is rather recorded on the spur of the moment. Here's another recurring visual detail that's likely to call to mind factual rather than fictional filmmaking traditions. New scenes often begin with the camera partly or wholly hidden behind a wall or a door before a horizontal dolly shot slowly reveals the setting. This rather unusual way of establishing a scene is rich in connotations. It creates the impression that the camera is creeping up on the characters, eavesdropping on them, or trying to disclose something, none of which really makes much sense in fictional drama, of course, where everything is staged, so the filmmakers are perfectly free to present any information any way they please. There is no reality to sneak up on. The expose-style camera move is merely a fleeting gesture towards the visual trope that we tend to associate with the documentary tradition. It lasts just 10 seconds or so, then the rest of the scene plays itself out more conventionally. Of course, the camera move is really too smooth, the lighting too cinematic to carry unequivocal connotations of investigative, muckraking, guerrilla-style filmmaking. Actually, many of these sequences are reminiscent of a visual trope familiar from fictional film and television work as well, namely the subjective point of view shot, where the camera stands in for the eyes of one of the characters. But point of view shots are not typically found at the very beginning of scenes, and they're not typically used to establish a scene, but rather for dramatic purposes, like suspense. And of course in The Wire they are unattributed. The point of view doesn't belong to anyone. Again, it's merely a gesture, I think, meant to conjure up a vague sense of voyeurism. Equally ambiguous are the many instances of surveillance footage that regularly turned up in the first season, before gradually disappearing and then turning up again in the fifth and final season. These images enjoy a kind of documentary status within the story world of The Wire, though of course they're just as staged and manufactured as anything else in the series. In fact, one could argue that the insertion of this surveillance footage is The Wire's most conspicuous stylistic indulgence, as the visual presentation here attracts attention to itself, not just because the black and white imagery stands out from everything else, but also because of how the camera seems to move on its own in order to pick up and to dwell on the monitors that display what the surveillance cameras are recording. Again, it creates a curious voyeuristic vibe. Curious because it doesn't seem to be attached to anything or anyone within the story. The voyeurism emanates from the narration itself, which makes these moments highly self-conscious. Thus, despite The Wire's largely stripped-down, unobtrusive and unpretentious visuals, there are in fact conflicting aesthetic sensibilities at play throughout the series. So while David Simon has sometimes talked about documentaries as a key influence, he's also talked admiringly about how veteran film producer Robert Colesbury was able to make The Wire look and feel like a movie. Others on the production have mentioned this as well. Director of photography Uta Brizewicz, for example, has said that the notion of making The Wire look like a feature film was there from the start, and that Colesbury was keen to move the camera around and to play various layers of depth off each other in the frame. Also, take the example of the 4:3 aspect ratio. Simon explains that he finds that the more quadratic shape feels more like real life and real television and not like a movie. I have to admit I'm not exactly sure what he means or how Simon would justify this statement, but the important point is that the wire's aspect ratio was chosen for its ability to reflect or invoke reality. But at the same time, notice how frequently the conventional 4:3 image is broken up and played with in order to create greater visual interest, for example by filming the action through windows or doorways to create a frame within the frame. Or more than one frame within the frame. Often the wire will take advantage of vertical and horizontal lines to give various shapes to that area of the image we're meant to focus our attention on, the one that contains visually relevant information, typically bodies and faces. Long lenses are regularly used to shoot across an object in the foreground, rendering it out of focus, in effect shading or masking part of the screen to create visual variation. Horizontal lines are used most frequently. This of course creates a kind of widescreen effect. The horizontal line can be anything. Tables of course are often used to split the image in two, leaving one part where little happens and one part that our eyes are drawn to. Occasionally the remaining image is really wide, which definitely gives it a more cinematic look. So although all 5 seasons of The Wire are shown in the 4:3 format, there seems to be a constant struggle to break free of the traditional aspect ratio of television, or to experiment with it, to forsake parts of the screen to explore more varied alternative shapes, particularly widescreen formats that we typically associate with film. But there are many ways in which The Wire strays from the documentary aesthetic. It's not just in the presentation of the surveillance footage, for example, that the camera goes fishing. In more emotionally charged scenes too, the camera may break away from the drama taking place between the characters to suggest to us what they are thinking, and in the process foreshadow future
like
events.
What, dollhouse miniatures?
Hey, a life. A life, Jimmy. You know what that is? It's the shit that happens while you're waiting for moments that never come.
Or to comment on the action, as in this scene, where the camera racks focus to highlight a picture of Nick's uncle in the background, as he is questioned by the police. Or to remind viewers of the stakes. Here Stringer seduces D'Angelo's girlfriend, and the camera veers off on its own, pausing at some photos of D'Angelo and their baby. This actually happens twice. In all of these scenes, the camera acts self-consciously. It anticipates in a way that a documentarian's camera wouldn't. It fishes, in David Simon's words, and knows more than it ought to know. There's another visual motif besides the surveillance footage that runs counter to the keep it simple, close to the documentary aesthetic that The Wire's creators mention as an ideal. I'm thinking of the many shots of characters' faces framed in the rearview mirrors of cars, mostly while they're on stakeout. Thus there's a link between these images and the surveillance footage, as both indicate a sense of voyeurism, of observing someone without their knowledge. What makes these rearview mirror shots so hard to reconcile with the documentary tradition is their artfulness. The precision of the framing runs counter to the spontaneous, unplanned look that we so instinctively tend to associate with documentary filmmaking. This on-the-fly quality is not necessarily the prevailing look of most documentaries, of course. It's just the prototypical look. But anyway, the deliberate design of these shots clearly comes in conflict with our archetypal idea of that style. Very occasionally fisheye lenses are used, which gives such a distorted perspective that the device draws attention to itself. And in this scene from the second season, a dolly zoom creates an unsettling effect. Notice here how the background seems to be receding while the foreground remains the same. It's very much a cinematic touch. The opening shot of the 6th episode of Season 1 is an impressive long continuous take. Again, you'd be much more likely to come across a shot like this in a feature film than a television series, or certainly a documentary. It's hardly on a par with such famous opening sequences as those in Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, or Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. But it's nicely done nevertheless. Occasionally, the 180-degree rule is deliberately breached, as in this scene where Irvin Burrell and Tommy Carcetti are having lunch. When you break the 180-degree rule, the spatial relationships in the scene are inconsistent. Notice here how the two characters seem to magically swap seats every now and then. Burrell is mostly facing right and Carcetti left, but occasionally there's a shot taken from the other side of the axis, so it appears that they've switched sides. Here's a more conventional example also involving Carcetti, now mayor, struggling to get to grips with the news that the serial killer they've been chasing throughout season 5 wasn't real, trying to look at it from all angles, so to speak. But these are the rare exceptions. On the whole, as we've seen, The Wire's style is quite basic and restrained, and this restraint has much to recommend it. So many films and television series these days are overloaded with stylistic flourishes. It seems to me that this merely creates a general sense of hysteria. When the filmmakers want to highlight a climactic moment, they have nothing left in the toolbox to get the job done, because everything is emphasized all the time. Eventually, nothing stands out. When everything is presented as climactic, nothing is climactic. Thankfully, The Wire is quite disciplined in this respect. For example, while the camera is in almost constant motion, for the most part the movement is subdued, often barely noticeable. The cutting isn't exactly slow most of the time, but there are many long takes where the action unfolds at a leisurely pace. This means that when a swift camera move does appear for a decisive dramatic moment, it actually carries weight. It truly registers as a point of emphasis.
I could use some coffee. You want some coffee? I need a word with you.
Lieutenant, we're just about to go.
Now.
Also, unlike the majority of today's mainstream film and television, The Wire isn't over-reliant on close-ups. In fact, there's an unusual amount of two-shots, mid-shots and long shots in the series, and it profits from it. First of all, wider framings tend to be more varied, I think, and often more visually arresting than close-ups. Second, the acting often benefits. Nobody can give a fiercer look of contempt than Bunk Moreland just by tilting his head, but include his upper body as well, and it's even more devastating.
Videotapes.
Wide framings also encourage viewers to pay attention and become aware of things on their own. Here we see Nick and his girlfriend house hunting. It's clear that they can't afford it, however, and the point is underlined by the two looks that Nick casts at the car of the next couple about to look at the apartment. Those looks really say more than 1,000 words. They practically lay bare Nick's mind to us, yet the filmmakers don't draw our attention to it. The same information could have been provided by other means, of course. Instead of a continuous take filmed at a distance, the scene could have been broken down into its constituent parts, shown from different angles. So first there would be a cut to a close-up of Nick looking at the car, then a cutaway, a point-of-view shot or an eyeline match demonstrating to us what he's looking at, and then perhaps finally another close-up of Nick detailing his reaction. The information would have been the same, but it just wouldn't have been nearly as subtle or compelling in my view. When such a telling incident is offered as a throwaway moment, there's always a risk that not everybody in the audience is going to catch it, but for those who do, it's all the more satisfying. When people say that films should show rather than tell, they usually have in mind that filmmakers should rely on visuals, not dialogue, to tell the story. I think sequences that have no words can tell as well, when the editing spoon-feeds you every detail and spells everything out for you. That too can be a kind of telling. The Wire, thankfully, relies for the most part on showing rather than telling. I think it all goes back really to the satisfaction you get from watching something that addresses you as an adult. The Wire demands that you pay attention and rewards you when you do. Wide framings and various layers of depth may enhance comedy as well. In this scene, Herc and Carve have a heated discussion with Poot, a low-level drug dealer. Eventually they let him go, but before the latter is out of earshot, Herc returns to a long-running conversation he's been having with his police partner. Poot doesn't know the context of the comment coming up, however, so he is understandably perplexed.
Get the fuck out of here.
How about a hand job? Huh? Oh man, you don't even get Wheezy Jefferson for a hand job.
Again, this scene could have been filmed very differently, breaking the comedy down into discrete building blocks. So you'd have a close-up of the delivery and then a couple of reaction shots of faces, also in close-up or medium close-up. Personally, I find this rather annoying. It's an unimaginative and overly didactic way of presenting the action. It's as if everything has been pre-digested for you. By presenting it in a long shot, in a continuous take with various layers of depth within the frame, the spatial and temporal integrity of the scene is preserved. It's still carefully staged and timed, of course, but you don't get the sense that the filmmakers have set out to tell you a joke and they're going to walk you through it step by step. It's simply a much more subtle and rewarding and humorous form of filmmaking. Poot's perplexity is all the funnier because it's so understated, conveyed simply by the turning of his slightly out-of-focus head. And it's organic, it's not a cutaway so the detail doesn't draw attention to itself. The cutting too is interesting. Director and co-executive producer of The Wire, Joe Chappelle, has stated that the editing is lean and straightforward. It's not flashy but very basic and minimal. And he notes that there are not even any fades or dissolves, just straight no-nonsense cuts. But once again, there's a tension between the evident plainness of the show and a striving for something more elaborate and artful. In this first clip, there's a thematic connection between the two scenes, so that they seem to somehow comment on each other.
They always people watching.
Watching? You. Yeah.
Here, the juxtaposition of the two scenes connected by the cut creates a correspondence that highlights the disparities between those who enforce the law and those who break it.
See if you can get your take-home car back.
Budget officer called an hour ago, telling us to relieve colonels and below of take-home vehicles.
In the third example, it's the visual motif of fire that ties the two scenes together.
They cleaned the motherfucker out, Joe.
It's the fourth example that's the most interesting one, I think. Here there's a nice graphic match between the face of the dead woman that D'Angelo finds and the image on the wall behind him as he backs away in the next shot. Some of the imagery on The Wire is also wonderfully evocative, such as this orange sofa located in the middle of the pit, the social housing project lot. No longer the gathering place of happy family life, it's placed outside the home where it serves as a kind of unofficial headquarters for young low-level drug dealers. In the next to last episode of Season 1, the police start making arrests based on the investigation we have followed. It ends on a long shot of the sofa in the middle of a sunny day, deserted. Thus a piece of furniture customarily associated with domesticity stands alone in a barren landscape, surrounded by the morbidly dull, lifeless high-rises where people actually live. It's an eerily ambiguous image. The slow-crawling camera lingering on the emptiness of a space formerly full of life lends it a mournful quality, and raises doubts that the children are any better off than before. It's of course also a kind of epilogue to the police action against the drug trade, but the imagery seems less triumphal than foreboding. And to be sure, towards the end of the next episode, the season finale, the pit has once more come to life. The orange sofa has been replaced with a black one, from which Poot, up to now a street dealer, is now overseeing the trade, passing on instructions and advice that we have earlier seen imparted to him.
What's that? Huh? You taking niggas' money, then you serve them? What the fuck?
We see then how a seemingly simple prop both serves to add complexity and resonance to some of the show's key themes, as well as to shrewdly convey narrative information. Removing such a familiar object, traditionally depicted as the peaceful focal point of friendship and family, especially perhaps in the sitcom genre, from its household surroundings, and placing it in an alien context, smack in the middle of the drug market, tells us much about life in the pit, though not in any straightforward or easily paraphrasable manner. It shows how drugs break up families and cast children out into a world of violence and ruthlessness. At the same time, the image of the sofa in an urban wasteland is a testament to the perseverance of the human spirit, for it is also depicted as a site of camaraderie, solidarity, and education. Finally, it expresses one of the main themes of The Wire, the cyclical nature of the modern urban environment. Humans are simply interchangeable parts in a vast societal machine. Faces and names may change, as when Poot replaces D'Angelo, but the mechanics stay the same. Finally, I want to look at The Wire's key metaphor, whereby the drug trade is regularly referred to as the game, and in this famous scene from Season 1 it's more specifically compared to a game of chess. D'Angelo finds Wallace and Bodhi playing checkers on a chessboard and decides to teach them chess.
You get the other dude's king, you got the game. But he's trying to get your king too, so you got protected. Now the king, he move one space any direction he damn choose, cause he's the king.
The idea that some pieces/individuals are more expendable than others in the greater scheme of things is powerfully conveyed. Moreover, at the meta level, the fact that the actions of the various pieces are constrained by the rules of the game contributes to the sense of determinism and doom that permeates the Baltimore of The Wire. Indeed, David Simon has often described the series as a Greek tragedy. Chess pieces, of course, are not the masters of their own moves, and as such the characters of The Wire come to resemble the protagonists in the plays of Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles, whose fates are also not fully in their own hands. The Wire thus counters prevailing television narratives of redemption, of characters overcoming the odds that serve to validate the myth of the American dream. This template is the automatic frame of reference for Bodhi and Wallace, the two corner boys who have the rules explained to them by D'Angelo.
Alright, but if I make it to the end, I'm top dog.
Nah, yo, it ain't like that. Look, the pawns, man, in the game, they get capped quick. They be out the game early.
Unless they some smart-ass pawns.
Bodhi is clearly unable to see the bigger picture here. He identifies with the pawn, recognizing that in the analogy he is this least valuable piece on the board. But he is still dedicated to the notion that individual ability will be rewarded in the end. The scene thus highlights both the dark side of the American dream and the function of popular entertainment that The Wire seeks to expose, namely to appease and to draw attention away from the basic and systematic barriers to equal opportunity that exist in real life. Though the game is initially used to designate the drug trade, it is readily apparent that the analogy extends to the rules and habits within every institution depicted on the show. This is primarily conveyed through a series of carefully structured thematic parallels, which are rarely as explicit as in the following example.
Again. I-A-L-A-C. And what are we telling ourselves? I am lovable and capable. Now I see those smiling faces.
Where the listing on the lower half of the page indicates some typical soft target locations, an officer alert to the terrorist threat must ask himself.
But it's also conveyed through subtle visual cues, as in this scene where the characters learn that orders have been given to charge a murder even though the case is unlikely to hold up in court, simply to boost the clearance rate. These are the rules of the game. The aim is to improve the statistics by all means, whether it actually produces telling results or not. Just as this institutional dysfunction is most pointedly exposed in the conversation that ensues, the mise-en-scène alludes to the previous discussion between D'Angelo, Bodhi and Wallace about chess. Notice here how the characters are shot across an out-of-focus chessboard. Freeman, Bunk, Greggs and McNulty are made to look like pieces in the game, sandwiched between the two faceless players in the extreme foreground, only hands visible protruding from opposite sides of the frame to move the pieces about. The players resemble Olympian gods pulling the strings from above, making the characters mere puppets, victims of forces beyond their control. In conclusion, let me reiterate that I'm not arguing that The Wire's style is the show's preeminent quality, though it's not, of course, really feasible to separate it from the acting or the dialogue or the piercing political and social critique. But in any case, I hope I've shown that the series' formal features merit close scrutiny and that the style is more sophisticated and rewarding than critics have been prepared to acknowledge.